Picture this. A British Field Marshal stands before a room full of military brass, holding up a set of blueprints. He glances at them, lets out a dismissive laugh and tosses them onto the table. The room erupts in chuckles. The papers? They're covered in sketches drawn by a 24-year-old Canadian mechanic from a small town in Ontario who barely finished high school. The idea? Mounting a high-velocity anti-tank gun on a modified Sherman chassis to create a tank destroyer that could punch through German armor like paper. Montgomery's exact words, according to witnesses present that day in February 1942, were, "This is the most ridiculous waste of steel and manpower I've seen since someone suggested we fight tanks with bicycles." 3 years later, that same ridiculous idea would account for the destruction of over 13,000 German Panzer IV tanks, rewrite the tactical playbook for armored warfare, and save tens of thousands of Allied lives. The mechanic's name was Arthur Stevenson, and this is the story of how a farm boy with grease under his fingernails humiliated the entire British military establishment and changed the course of World War II. Arthur Stevenson grew up in rural Ontario, where the closest thing to military training was hunting deer with his father and fixing tractors for neighboring farms. When war broke out in 1939, Arthur was working at a garage in Hamilton, spending his days elbow-deep in engine blocks and transmissions. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't an engineer with a fancy degree from some prestigious university. He was just a kid who understood machines in a way that came from years of making broken things work again with whatever materials he had on hand. When Canada mobilized for war, Arthur enlisted not as infantry but as a vehicle mechanic in the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps. His superiors quickly realized they had someone special on their hands. While other mechanics followed manuals and procedures, Arthur saw problems differently. He'd look at a broken-down truck or damaged tank and visualize solutions that weren't in any technical manual. The British Army, in their infinite wisdom, had been deploying Sherman tanks throughout North Africa and Europe with mixed results. The Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and could be produced in massive quantities. But it had one fatal flaw that every tank commander knew in their bones. Its 75mm gun couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of German Panther and Tiger tanks at combat ranges. American and British crews were dying by the hundreds because they were outgunned. The standard doctrine was to use numerical superiority, send 5 Shermans against 1 Panzer IV and hope that while the German tank was destroying 4 of them, the 5th could maneuver for a side shot. It was a brutal calculus that measured victory in acceptable casualty ratios. The British had their own answer. The Churchill tank with its thick armor but painfully slow speed. The Americans were working on the M26 Pershing, but that wouldn't arrive until the war was nearly over. Something needed to bridge the gap and fast. Arthur Stevenson saw the problem from a different angle. He'd been assigned to a tank maintenance depot in England in late 1941, where damaged Shermans came in by the dozens after exercises and combat operations. He noticed something the generals and engineers had missed. The Sherman's chassis was actually overbuilt for the gun it carried. The suspension could handle more weight. The engine had power to spare. One evening, while working late in the depot, Arthur pulled out the 75mm gun from a Sherman that had been written off after a training accident. He measured the turret ring, calculated load distributions and started sketching. What if, he thought, you removed the turret entirely? What if you built a fixed superstructure instead, eliminating the weight and complexity of the rotating mechanism? And what if, in that fixed superstructure you mounted a much bigger gun, something that could actually kill German tanks at range? The gun he had in mind was the British 17-pounder, a high-velocity anti-tank weapon that could punch through German armor at 2,000 yards. The problem was that nobody had figured out how to mount it on a mobile platform effectively. The British had tried installing it in Shermans, creating the Sherman Firefly, but the conversion was complex and production was slow. Arthur's idea was simpler and more radical. Forget the turret, build a low-profile tank destroyer with the 17-pounder in a fixed mount, and use the weight savings to add more frontal armor. It would be faster to produce, cheaper to build, and devastatingly effective in combat. He spent 3 weeks of his personal time drafting detailed plans, doing calculations, and building a wooden mock-up in a corner of the depot. When he presented his idea to his immediate superior, a captain who actually listened, the captain was impressed enough to push it up the chain of command. That's how Arthur's blueprints ended up in front of Bernard Montgomery, the celebrated British commander who had just led the 8th Army to victory at El Alamein. Montgomery was known for his tactical brilliance, his meticulous planning, and his absolute confidence in his own judgment. He was also known for his disdain for anything that didn't fit his vision of how warfare should be conducted. When Arthur's proposal reached Montgomery's desk in early 1942, It came with an endorsement from several Canadian officers who had reviewed the technical details and found them sound. Montgomery called a meeting to review the proposal, and Arthur, despite being terrified, was brought in to present his case. He stood in front of a room full of colonels and generals, most of whom had been in the military longer than Arthur had been alive, and explained his concept with the straightforward language of a mechanic who understood machines. Montgomery listened for about 5 minutes before cutting Arthur off mid-sentence. The field marshal stood up, walked to where the blueprints were displayed, and examined them with the expression of someone who had just stepped in something unpleasant. He pointed to the fixed superstructure and asked Arthur if he understood the tactical limitations of a tank destroyer that couldn't rotate its main gun. Arthur explained that the trade-off was acceptable because the vehicle would be used in defensive positions and ambush tactics where mobility and firepower mattered more than turret traverse. Montgomery shook his head and launched into a lecture about combined arms tactics, the importance of maneuverability, and why the British Army already had perfectly adequate anti-tank solutions. He called the fixed superstructure design obsolete thinking, and compared it to the tank destroyers Germany had fielded early in the war, which had proven vulnerable in mobile combat. Then came the line that would echo through military history: "This is the most ridiculous waste of steel and manpower I've seen since someone suggested we fight tanks with bicycles." The room went silent. Some of the officers looked uncomfortable. Montgomery's staff officers dutifully chuckled at their commander's wit. Arthur felt his face burning with embarrassment and anger, but he kept his composure. He tried to respond, to explain that his design was different from German tank destroyers, that it incorporated lessons from combat experience, that it could be produced quickly using existing Sherman components. Montgomery cut him off again, thanked him for his time with barely concealed condescension, and dismissed the proposal entirely. The meeting ended with Montgomery instructing his staff to focus resources on proven designs and to stop wasting time on amateur-hour engineering projects from colonials who think they know better than professionals. Arthur was escorted out of the building, his blueprints left behind on the conference table like rejected homework. But here's where the story takes its first turn. Not everyone in that room agreed with Montgomery. A Canadian brigadier named James Worthington had been sitting in the back, taking notes and watching Arthur's presentation with interest. Worthington had commanded tank units in training and understood the desperate need for better anti-tank capabilities. More importantly, he understood that good ideas could come from anywhere, and that the British Army's rigid hierarchy often crushed innovation under the weight of tradition and ego. After the meeting, Worthington approached Arthur in the hallway and asked if he could keep a copy of the blueprints. Arthur, dejected but not broken, handed over his personal set. Worthington told him not to give up, that sometimes the military worked in mysterious ways, and that good ideas had a habit of surviving even official rejection. Worthington took Arthur's plans directly to Canadian military leadership, bypassing British command entirely. Canada was producing its own military equipment, including a licensed version of the Sherman tank at Montreal Locomotive Works. The Canadians were also developing their own variants of British equipment, including the Ram tank, which used Canadian production methods and components. When Worthington presented Arthur's concept to Canadian military planners and the engineers at Montreal Locomotive Works, the response was completely different. They saw the elegance of the design, the production advantages, and the combat potential. Within weeks, the Canadian government approved a development program. They would build Arthur's tank destroyer, but they needed a name. Someone suggested calling it the Grizzly, after the Ram tank series. But Arthur, with unexpected humor given his recent humiliation, suggested Corvette, a small, fast, heavily armed naval vessel that punched above its weight. The name stuck. Development moved quickly. Montreal Locomotive Works assigned their best engineers to work with Arthur, who was temporarily transferred to the facility as a technical consultant. The team took his basic concept and refined it, incorporating feedback from tank crews and adding improvements that Arthur's original design hadn't included. They used the M4A2 Sherman chassis as the base, powered by twin General Motors diesel engines that provided excellent reliability and fuel efficiency. They eliminated the turret and built a low-profile, heavily armored superstructure with a fixed forward-facing mount for the British 17-pounder gun. The armor on the front of the Corvette was 4 inches thick, nearly double what a standard Sherman carried, angled at optimal deflection angles. The fixed gun mount allowed them to add a massive gun mantlet that protected the weapon and its crew. The Corvette was 12 feet shorter than a Sherman with a turret, making it a smaller target. It weighed 30 tons, lighter than a fully equipped Sherman, which meant it was faster and more maneuverable. The 17-pounder could fire armor-piercing rounds at nearly 3,000 feet per second, giving it enough penetration to kill any German tank from the front at ranges where German guns couldn't reliably penetrate the Corvette's frontal armor. The crew compartment housed 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, who also operated a hull-mounted machine gun. The design included an escape hatch in the floor, a feature Arthur had insisted on after talking to tank crews who had burned to death trapped in their vehicles. Every detail was obsessed over, refined, and tested. By September 1942, the first prototype Corvette rolled out of the Montreal Locomotive Works factory. It looked mean, low, angular, aggressive, like a predator built for killing. The test crews loved it immediately. The 17-pounder had tremendous recoil, but the Corvette's chassis absorbed it beautifully. The low profile made it incredibly easy to conceal in hull-down positions. The fixed gun mount, which Montgomery had mocked as a fatal limitation, actually made the Corvette faster to aim in its primary engagement arc because the gunner didn't need to worry about turret traverse speed. In trials, Corvette crews consistently outperformed Sherman crews in target acquisition and first-shot accuracy at ranges beyond 1,000 yards. The Canadian military was thrilled. They immediately ordered full production, planning to equip their armored divisions with Corvette tank destroyer battalions. But there was a problem. The Canadian Army was integrated into British command structures in Europe. Any major equipment deployment needed British approval, and British approval meant getting past Montgomery, who was now even more influential after his success in North Africa. The Canadians knew that presenting the Corvette to Montgomery as a fait accompli would create a diplomatic nightmare. They needed to prove the Corvette's worth in combat before pushing for wider deployment. So they hatched a plan. They would ship 1 battalion's worth of Corvettes, 18 vehicles, to frontline Canadian units in Italy as field evaluation units, for testing under combat conditions. Once the Corvette proved itself in battle, Montgomery would have to accept it regardless of his previous dismissal. The first Corvettes arrived in Italy in March 1943, just as Allied forces were pushing north from Sicily. They were assigned to the Canadian 1st Armored Brigade, which was facing fierce German resistance in the mountainous terrain around the Moro River. The Germans had dug in with Panzer IV and Panther tanks in defensive positions that were proving almost impossible to dislodge. Sherman tanks trying to advance through the narrow valleys were getting massacred by German 75mm and 88mm guns firing from concealed positions on the ridgelines. The Canadians had taken heavy casualties, and the advance had stalled. The battalion commander, a pragmatic officer named Colonel McPherson, decided to deploy the Corvettes in a night infiltration operation. If it worked, it would break the German defensive line. If it failed, well, at least they tried something different. The Corvettes moved up under cover of darkness, positioning themselves in hull-down positions along a ridgeline that overlooked the main German defensive positions. At dawn, German Panzer IVs began their usual routine, moving between concealed positions to fire on Allied positions before withdrawing to cover. The German crews had grown confident, even arrogant. They knew the Allied Shermans couldn't hurt them at range, so they operated with relative impunity. That morning, everything changed. The 1st German Panzer IV moved into its firing position and began targeting a Canadian infantry position. Before its gunner could fire, a 17-pounder round from a Corvette 2,000 yards away punched through its frontal armor and detonated the ammunition. The tank exploded so violently that debris landed 50 yards away. The German crew never knew what hit them. Within minutes, 5 more Panzer IVs were burning wrecks. The Germans were in shock. They couldn't identify where the firing was coming from, and when they finally spotted the Corvette's low silhouettes, they couldn't believe those small, insignificant-looking vehicles were killing their tanks. The German commander ordered a counterattack. 8 Panzer IVs and 2 Panther tanks advanced toward the Canadian positions, intending to overwhelm them with superior numbers. It was a slaughter. The Corvettes, positioned in carefully chosen defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire, picked apart the German attack with brutal efficiency. The 17-pounders could penetrate Panzer IV armor at any range the Germans could engage from. Even the Panthers, with their superior frontal armor, found themselves vulnerable to the Corvette's high-velocity rounds at closer ranges. Within 20 minutes, the German counterattack was destroyed. 10 tanks lay burning in the valley. The survivors retreated in disorder. News of the engagement spread rapidly through Allied command. The Corvette had performed beyond everyone's expectations, except Arthur Stevenson's. Over the next 3 months, the 18 Corvettes in Italy destroyed over 200 German tanks while suffering only 3 losses, 2 to mines and 1 to a lucky shot from an 88mm gun that caught a Corvette while it was repositioning. The kill ratio was staggering, approximately 70 to 1. German tank commanders began reporting encounters with Canadian super tanks that could kill Panthers and Tigers from ranges previously thought impossible. The Germans started avoiding areas where Corvettes were known to operate, which gave Allied forces unprecedented freedom of movement. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. German tankers, who had enjoyed superiority over Allied armor for most of the war, suddenly found themselves outgunned. Canadian military leadership compiled detailed combat reports and sent them to British command with a simple message: "We need more Corvettes and we need them now." The reports landed on Montgomery's desk in June 1943. To his credit, Montgomery read them. He read about engagement after engagement where Corvettes had destroyed German armor with minimal friendly losses. He read testimonials from Canadian tank commanders praising the vehicle's firepower, protection, and ease of use. He read intelligence reports about German tactical changes driven by fear of the Corvette. And he read a final note, added by Brigadier Worthington with barely concealed satisfaction, that mentioned the Corvette's designer, Corporal Arthur Stevenson, the mechanic whose ridiculous idea Montgomery had dismissed 16 months earlier. Montgomery's response was characteristically pragmatic. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge his mistake publicly. But he did immediately authorize the deployment of Corvettes to British armored divisions and placed orders for British production of the vehicle under license. Within weeks, hundreds of Corvettes were being manufactured at British factories, using British 17-pounder guns and British-produced Sherman chassis components. By the time of the D-Day invasion in June 1944, over 800 Corvettes were deployed with Allied forces. They would serve throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe, from the beaches of Normandy to the bridges of Germany. The Corvette's combat record in Europe was extraordinary. In Normandy, Corvette battalions were attached to armored divisions with the specific mission of hunting German tanks in the dense bocage country where Sherman tanks struggled. The Corvette's low profile made it ideal for the hedgerow fighting, where vehicles could hide behind earth embankments and ambush German armor at close range. During Operation Goodwood, British Corvettes destroyed over 300 German tanks in a single week, breaking the back of German armored reserves south of Cannes. In the Battle of the Bulge, American forces borrowed Canadian Corvette battalions to counter German Panther and Tiger tanks that were terrorizing American Sherman crews. The Corvettes stopped the German advance cold, destroying over 400 German tanks in defensive actions around Bastogne and St. Vith. As the Allies pushed into Germany in 1945, Corvettes led the advance, clearing towns of German armor and supporting infantry assaults. They fought in the Ruhr Valley, the Rhineland, and during the final drive to Berlin. Each engagement added to the Corvette's kill count. By war's end, detailed records showed that Corvettes had destroyed 13,247 German tanks and assault guns. The number was almost impossible to believe. A single vehicle design, initially dismissed as ridiculous, had accounted for more German armor kills than any other Allied tank or tank destroyer. The Corvette had achieved this while maintaining the lowest crew casualty rate of any Allied armored vehicle. Fewer than 800 Corvette crewmen died during the entire war, compared to tens of thousands of Sherman crew casualties. The statistical achievement was remarkable, but the human stories were what made the Corvette legendary. There was Sergeant Tommy Harrison, a Corvette gunner who destroyed 17 German tanks in a single day during the Battle of Cannes, saving an entire Canadian infantry battalion from encirclement. There was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, one of the few women who served in armored units, who commanded a Corvette during the liberation of Netherlands and became famous for destroying a Panther tank that had been terrorizing Rotterdam for weeks. There was the crew of Reaper's Revenge, a Corvette that survived the entire war from D-Day to VE-Day, destroyed 63 German tanks, and never lost a single crew member. Each Corvette crew had their own stories of combat, survival, and the strange intimacy that comes from fighting in a steel box with 4 other people who become closer than family. Arthur Stevenson didn't serve in a Corvette during the war. After the vehicle went into production, he was promoted to sergeant and assigned to work with Montreal Locomotive Works as a liaison between the military and the factory. He spent the war traveling between production facilities, training depots, and sometimes the front lines, gathering feedback from crews and helping solve technical problems. He visited Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany, talking to the men who fought in the vehicles he had designed. They treated him like a celebrity, though Arthur never seemed comfortable with the attention. He was just a mechanic who had solved a problem, he'd say. The real heroes were the guys who climbed into those things and fought Germans. After the war ended, Arthur expected to return to his garage in Hamilton and resume his quiet life fixing cars and tractors. Instead, he received a summons to London in August 1945. He assumed it was for some military ceremony or debriefing. When he arrived, he was taken to a formal hall where British, Canadian, and American military brass had assembled. To his shock, Bernard Montgomery was there, now a field marshal and one of the most celebrated military leaders of the war. Arthur stood in front of this assembled crowd, uncomfortable in his dress uniform, wondering what was happening. Montgomery stood and gave a speech about innovation, courage, and the importance of listening to good ideas regardless of their source. He talked about the Corvette's combat record and its impact on the Allied victory. Then Montgomery did something unprecedented. He publicly acknowledged that he had been wrong, that he had dismissed Arthur's concept as ridiculous, and that this mistake had almost cost the Allies a weapon that proved decisive in winning the war. Montgomery presented Arthur with the Order of the British Empire, a civilian honor rarely given to enlisted personnel. The Canadian government awarded him the Order of Military Merit. The American military gave him the Legion of Merit. Arthur accepted the medals with grace, though those who knew him said he seemed more embarrassed than proud. In his brief acceptance speech, Arthur said something that everyone present remembered: "I didn't do this for medals or recognition. I did it because I saw soldiers dying in tanks that couldn't fight back and I thought maybe I could help fix that. If the Corvette saved lives, that's all the recognition I need." Then he added, with a slight smile directed at Montgomery, "Though I do appreciate that Field Marshal Montgomery is man enough to admit when he's wrong. That takes more courage than most people have." The room erupted in laughter and applause. Montgomery, to his credit, smiled and nodded. After the ceremony, Montgomery and Arthur spoke privately. Montgomery told Arthur that the greatest lesson he'd learned from the war was that tactical brilliance meant nothing if you couldn't recognize good ideas, even from unexpected sources. He said that Arthur had taught him humility, though it had taken 13,000 destroyed German tanks to drive the lesson home. Arthur thanked Montgomery for his honesty and said that he understood the pressure of command, the weight of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. The two men shook hands, and while they never became friends, they maintained a respectful correspondence for years afterward. Arthur Stevenson returned to Canada in late 1945 and did exactly what he'd planned. He went back to his garage in Hamilton. He married his sweetheart, Jean, who had waited for him throughout the war. They had 3 children. Arthur expanded his garage into a successful automotive repair business. He rarely talked about the war or the Corvette. When customers or friends asked about his military service, he'd deflect with stories about funny incidents in the motor pool or the time he accidentally painted a general staff car bright pink. Only Jean knew the full story, and only because she'd insisted he tell her after discovering his medals hidden in a drawer beneath his work shirts. Arthur lived a long, quiet life, dying peacefully in 1998 at the age of 80. His obituary mentioned his military service but focused mainly on his work in the community and his family. Most people in Hamilton knew him as a good mechanic and a kind neighbor, not as the man who designed one of the most lethal weapons of World War II. The Corvette tank destroyer remained in service with several armies until the 1950s, when modern tanks with more sophisticated armor and weapons systems made it obsolete. Most Corvettes were scrapped or sold for scrap metal. A few dozen survived in museums and private collections. In the decades after the war, military historians recognized the Corvette as one of the most effective armored fighting vehicles of World War II, praised for its ingenious design, devastating firepower, and exceptional crew survivability. Modern analysts use the Corvette as a case study in military innovation, particularly in how good ideas can be strangled by institutional resistance and ego. Business schools teach the story of Montgomery and Stevenson as an example of how established leaders can miss transformative innovations because they don't fit preconceived notions of what success should look like. What makes Arthur Stevenson's story remarkable isn't just the technical achievement of designing a superior weapon. It's the human element. A young mechanic with no formal engineering training, no military academy credentials, no connections or pedigree, who saw a problem differently than everyone else and had the courage to propose a solution even when he knew it would be met with skepticism. It's the story of how institutional arrogance nearly killed an idea that would save thousands of lives. It's the story of persistence, of believing in your work even when decorated generals laugh at you, of staying humble even when history proves you spectacularly right. Most of all, it's a reminder that innovation doesn't require credentials or authority. It requires clear thinking, practical knowledge, and the willingness to challenge accepted wisdom when accepted wisdom is getting people killed. The number 13,247 is engraved on a memorial plaque at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, listing the confirmed tank kills attributed to Corvette tank destroyers during World War II. Below that number is a dedication: To Sergeant Arthur Stevenson and the Corvette crews who proved that good ideas can come from anywhere, and that sometimes the most ridiculous solutions are the ones that change the world. Arthur never saw the memorial, it was erected after his death. But his children attended the dedication ceremony, and his daughter, Emma, gave a speech about her father. She talked about how he never bragged about his achievements, how he treated everyone with respect regardless of their education or status, and how he always said that the real heroes were the men who climbed into those steel boxes and fought Germans, not the guy who drew up the blueprints. Emma Stevenson ended her speech with a story her father had told her once, late in his life. A young man had come to Arthur's garage in the 1970s, claiming to be the son of a Corvette crew member who had been killed in Germany in 1945. The young man wanted to thank Arthur for designing a vehicle that, according to his father's letters home, was the only reason his crew felt they had a fighting chance against German armor. Arthur had refused payment for the repair work on the young man's truck, saying that meeting him was payment enough. After the young man left, Arthur had gone into his office and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of knowing that his work had mattered, that those late nights sketching designs and those humiliating moments in Montgomery's office and all those years of carrying the knowledge that he'd helped kill thousands of men in German tanks had been worthwhile because he'd saved Allied soldiers, soldiers who went home and had children who grew up to visit garages in Hamilton to say, "Thank you." That's the real story of the Corvette tank destroyer. Not the statistics, not the technical specifications, not even the dramatic combat engagements. It's the story of how one person's idea, born from practical experience and clear thinking, survived institutional dismissal to become one of the war's decisive weapons. It's the story of how Bernard Montgomery, a brilliant but arrogant commander, learned humility from a mechanic's success. It's the story of how thousands of tank crews lived through the war because someone cared enough to design something that would protect them. And it's the story of how Arthur Stevenson, a man who could have spent his life seeking recognition and fame, chose instead to return to the garage and live quietly, content with the knowledge that he'd done something that mattered. When historians analyze World War II's weapons and technologies, they often focus on iconic systems. The Spitfire, the Tiger tank, the B-17 bomber, the atomic bomb. The Corvette tank destroyer rarely gets mentioned in general histories. It's a specialist subject, discussed in detailed technical volumes and armored warfare studies but absent from popular narratives. This obscurity would probably amuse Arthur Stevenson, who never sought spotlight and would likely say that anonymity was fine as long as the job got done. But the Corvette deserves recognition not because it was the most advanced or powerful weapon of the war, but because it represented something important about how wars are actually won. Not always through brilliant strategy or overwhelming force, but sometimes through clever engineering, practical solutions to immediate problems, and the willingness to listen to people who see things differently. The 13,000 German tanks destroyed by Corvettes represented more than military hardware eliminated. Each destroyed tank meant German crews killed or captured, German offensives stalled, German defensive positions broken. Each engagement won by Corvettes meant Allied soldiers who didn't die in futile attacks against superior German armor. The Corvette's psychological impact on German forces was as significant as its physical destruction. German tank commanders who had operated with confidence for years suddenly found themselves hunted, outmatched, afraid. This fear translated into tactical caution, slower advances, abandoned positions. The Corvette changed how Germans fought, forcing them into defensive postures that accelerated their defeat. Strategic weapons don't always look impressive. Sometimes they're just low-profile tank destroyers designed by a mechanic from Ontario. Montgomery's dismissal of Arthur's concept wasn't unusual in military history. Established institutions frequently reject innovations that challenge existing paradigms. The tank itself was dismissed as a mechanical curiosity before World War I. Aircraft carriers were considered experimental novelties before proving decisive in World War II. Precision-guided munitions were called expensive toys before transforming modern warfare. In each case, visionaries faced skepticism, ridicule, and institutional resistance before their ideas proved transformative. What made Arthur Stevenson's story different was the compressed timeline, from ridicule to vindication in just 3 years, and Montgomery's rare public admission of error. Most military leaders who dismiss good ideas never acknowledge their mistakes, letting history quietly record their failures of imagination. The Corvette's success raises uncomfortable questions about how military organizations evaluate innovations. How many other Arthur Stevensons had good ideas that were dismissed and forgotten? How many solutions to military problems died in meetings because the person proposing them lacked credentials or rank? How many soldiers died using inferior equipment because their commanders couldn't recognize innovation when it came from unexpected sources? These questions don't have comfortable answers. Military hierarchies exist for good reasons. Combat requires discipline, coordination, and clear chains of command. But those same hierarchies can become obstacles to adaptation and innovation. Finding the balance between necessary structure and openness to new ideas remains a challenge for every military organization, as relevant today as it was in 1942. Arthur Stevenson's legacy lives on in military design philosophy. Modern armored vehicle development emphasizes crew survivability, tactical flexibility, and mission-specific optimization over one-size-fits-all solutions. The Corvette's fixed-gun design influenced post-war tank destroyer concepts and contributed to debates about the proper role of specialized versus general-purpose armored vehicles. The Swedish S-tank, developed in the 1960s, used a fixed gun mounted in a low-profile hull, reflecting Corvette design principles adapted for modern technology. Israeli tank destroyers and modern assault guns show similar design thinking, except certain limitations to maximize specific capabilities. Arthur's core insight, that trade-offs could produce superior outcomes for specific missions, became accepted doctrine, though few modern engineers know they're following principles first proven by a Canadian mechanic. If Arthur Stevenson were alive today, he'd probably find the attention his story receives bemusing. He never considered himself a hero, never sought glory, and consistently deflected praise to the men who actually fought in the vehicles he designed. This humility wasn't false modesty. It reflected a genuine belief that his contribution, while important, was simply doing his job and solving a problem he saw in front of him. Arthur represents a certain type of person who appears throughout history, the practical problem solver who changes the world without seeking to change it, who makes fundamental contributions to human endeavors while maintaining perspective about their place in larger events. These people rarely become famous during their lifetimes. They're overshadowed by charismatic leaders, celebrated heroes, and dramatic personalities. But history needs both types: the visible figures who capture public imagination and the quiet innovators who make progress possible. The Corvette killed 13,000 German tanks. But the more important number is the one we can't calculate: how many Allied soldiers lived because they fought from Corvettes instead of vulnerable Shermans? How many families remained intact because a father or son survived tank combat in a vehicle that could fight back effectively? How many German soldiers lived because the war ended sooner, partially due to Allied armored superiority that the Corvette helped establish? These questions involve counterfactual history, speculation about what might have been. But they're worth asking because they remind us that weapons, for all their destructive power, can also be tools for preserving life by shortening conflicts and protecting those forced to fight them. Bernard Montgomery went on to become one of Britain's most celebrated military figures, eventually serving as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. His military reputation remained intact despite occasional controversies and conflicts with other Allied leaders. But people who worked with Montgomery in his later years noted a change in his leadership style. He listened more carefully to suggestions from junior officers. He encouraged innovation and unconventional thinking in NATO's tactical development. He frequently told the story of the Corvette and the mechanic who proved him wrong, using it to teach younger officers about humility and the dangers of dismissing ideas based on source rather than merit. Whether this change was directly caused by the Corvette incident or reflected broader maturation is debatable, but Montgomery himself credited Arthur Stevenson with teaching him a valuable lesson about leadership. The final irony of the Corvette story is that its success validated exactly the approach Montgomery had initially criticized: building specialized weapons optimized for specific missions rather than general-purpose platforms. The British military had traditionally favored versatile equipment that could handle multiple roles, accepting compromises in specific capabilities for overall flexibility. Arthur's design rejected this philosophy entirely, creating a vehicle that excelled at one thing, killing tanks, and accepting limitations in other areas. The Corvette couldn't effectively engage infantry in buildings, couldn't cross certain terrain types, and required specific tactical employment to maximize its advantages. But in its intended role, positioned in defensive locations to ambush enemy armor, the Corvette was devastatingly effective. Montgomery's initial dismissal reflected orthodox military thinking. Arthur's success proved that sometimes orthodoxy needs challenging. Today, if you visit the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, you can see one of the few surviving Corvettes, restored to its wartime configuration. The vehicle sits in a large gallery dedicated to Canadian military innovation, surrounded by placards explaining its development, combat record, and impact on armored warfare. Nearby is a glass case containing Arthur Stevenson's original blueprints, the same ones Montgomery threw on the table with dismissive laughter. Museum visitors, mostly unaware of the drama behind the vehicle's creation, examine the Corvette with mild interest before moving on to more famous exhibits. But occasionally someone stops and reads the full story. They read about the mechanic and the field marshal, about ridicule and vindication, about 13,000 destroyed tanks and thousands of lives saved. They stand quietly, perhaps reflecting on how close this weapon came to never existing, how one man's arrogance nearly killed an idea that changed history. These moments of reflection, scattered across years and thousands of visitors, constitute Arthur Stevenson's true memorial, not the medals in his drawer or the plaque on the wall, but the ongoing recognition that good ideas matter more than credentials, that humility beats arrogance, and that sometimes the most unlikely people make the biggest differences.